Roughly 10% of white former farm owners have so far accepted the compensation payments.
They've had their 1%, and now it remains to see how they are happy with the treasury bills when they eventually get those, and whether at the time of maturity, whether the government will have US dollars to redeem the treasury bills.
The compensation payments are one of the requirements of international lenders to start a debt restructuring process. Zimbabwe cannot borrow from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. It's been in arrears to other lenders for more than 2 decades. Land ownership and compensation are emotive topics in this country, going back to the era of colonization beginning in the late 1800s. And some Zimbabweans don't want the government to pay out anything to white former landowners, a view that is also fueling political divisions.
The Zimbabwean government is going ahead to compensate the colonizers or the so-called white Zimbabwean farmers who stole the lands from native black Zimbabweans. Please subscribe, share, and comment. Thank you. The Zimbabwean government is going ahead to compensate the colonizers or the so-called white Zimbabwean farmers who stole the lands from native black Zimbabweans. Yes, you heard it right. The incompetent and mindless so-called leaders in Zimbabwe started to compensate the colonizers, the thieves, and the murderers to the detriment of their victims. Shit. This is beyond understanding and is outrageous. Did President Mnangagwa ask his fellow Zimbabweans what they think before they decided to compensate these colonizers or so-called white farmers? Did President Mnangagwa and his government give up under the pressure of Americans and Europeans? If so, the coward so-called President Mnangagwa and his entourage show their incompetence and worthlessness. President Mnangagwa and government's decision to compensate the so-called white Zimbabwean farmers or colonizers in order to secure or obtain loans from IMF and the World Bank for Zimbabwe is beyond understanding. What normal human beings in their right mind have ever gone that far to denigrate their people, country, and race? Please, tell me. I'm wondering if the so-called African leaders have convinced themselves that they are God or the smartest black people who can decide anything for their fellow countrymen whenever and however they want. While the mindless so-called leaders in Zimbabwe have been compensating the colonizers or so-called white farmers, the American leaders have been prioritizing the settlement of the so-called white South Africans farmers in the United States. So, who is going to take care of the poor black Zimbabweans, whose lands were stolen and have been exploited for a century by these white Zimbabwean farmers? When will all this nonsense in African countries stop? The African so-called leaders are incompetent and lack visions. They have not even figured out that the World Bank and IMF have never contributed to the development of a single country on earth. The World Bank and IMF have only been impoverishing many countries and drowning many countries in colossal debts, particularly African countries. How difficult is it for the Zimbabwean government to realize that people who run the World Bank and IMF share the same ideology with these white Zimbabwean farmers and look just like them? At a time when other nations throughout the world are confronting and fighting against Western colonialism, imperialism, oppression, and exploitation to regain their sovereignty and take control of their destiny, the so-called president of Zimbabwe and the rest of African so-called presidents are submitting to their oppressors. Worse, they are rewarding the European colonizers, imperialists, oppressors, and looters. What a self-degradation and what a shame! What is really going on in Africa and what is wrong with African so-called leaders? For so long African so-called leaders have become sellouts, traitors, or inside enemies, and they are as vicious as the colonizers and imperialists who have been oppressing, exploiting, and dehumanizing black Africans. It is high time young African rose up and took their destiny into their own hands before it is too late. The clock is ticking. Black Africans must take draconian measures such as death penalty or lapidating to deal with the foolishness and behavior of the African so-called presidents and leaders. Either black Africans sit down to perish or they rise up to free themselves. Nobody will come to rescue black Africans, but themselves. Black Africans should not fear anybody because the Russians or the Houthis in Yemen have already shown them the way to the liberation and freedom. There is no such thing as powerful Western country. The ongoing war in Ukraine between Russia and NATO and the ongoing confrontation between the Americans and Houthis in Yemen have already proven the notion of powerful military or powerful nation to be a myth, a Western propaganda, and an intimidating tactic of the American and European imperialists. If Yemen, which is ranked among the poorest countries in the world by the same Westerners, is able to defeat in the battlefields the so-called most powerful country or the United States, what is the excuse of black Africans not to confront and or fight against their colonizers and oppressors? As it only takes the Houthis' courage and resolve to crush the power and ego of the so-called most powerful country in the world, what are black Africans waiting for? At this point, black Africans should have courage to go after their so-called African leaders who have also been undermining, oppressing, brutalizing, starving, and degrading them. It is insulting that Western imperialists often describe the incompetent and worthless so-called African leaders as strongmen, which means nothing but puppets, punk, and pudgy ass. It is now clear that the incompetent African so-called leaders have not yet learned anything from the past, and they are not going to learn anything now or in the future. It is embarrassing to hear the African so-called leaders taking orders from Western leaders. It is embarrassing to watch the African so-called leaders degrade themselves in front of crackhead Western leaders like President Macron. It is also shameful to see African so-called academics or intellectuals often regurgitating the viewpoints of their Western mentors and Western academics, instead of coming up with their own viewpoints or thinking for themselves. Does Mnangagwa, this incompetent and worthless so-called president of Zimbabwe, think he is helping his fellow Zimbabweans by deciding to compensate the white colonizers and thieves? Please, let me know what you think.